Hi, Read 508. This is Dr. Keisler, and this week we're discussing Chapter 10, which was Major Approaches and Materials for Reading Instruction. I actually realized when I was reviewing the screencasts that we had made already for this chapter that it was neat to see that I actually needed to re-record this one because, not necessarily because there were changes in the text, but there are some changes in California and nationwide with Common Core that made some of the old information that we shared in the screencast originally outdated. So I thought that that was kind of nice to see. So here I am re-recording this for this week. So I'd like to start by setting out two questions. The first is, what program do you remember being used when you were a child to teach reading in your classroom? And so sometimes when I ask this question, when we teach this in person, there are people that remember Dick and Jane. There are people that remember just reading out of books and not receiving any explicit phonics instruction, which would be a sign that they were taught a whole language program. I personally, I went to school back east. I don't remember specific phonics instruction. I don't remember any cards. I do remember in kindergarten making word families. So I remember my kindergarten teacher having a little house, and she'd have the rhyme, and it would say at, and then we would go ahead and we would make a list: cat, bat, hat. I remember that. The only thing I remember of phonics was a workbook that would be given to me to do some seat work sometimes, and the only reason I remember that it was phonics is because I remember it saying phonics on it, and I can remember that in first and second grade, that orange book that we had. But I kind of think I was probably in more of a whole language program. I was in school learning to read in the early 80s, so probably what I had. I remember a silver Burdett and Ginn reader. I remember one called the Magic Circle, so it was some sort of Basel reader. And I remember grouping, so that's something that many of you may remember too. I remember having, each year there'd be 3 or 4 groups in the classroom, and those were kind of your high readers, maybe 2 groups of your on-level readers, and then a group of your low readers. And, those we talk about why those groups should be flexible rather than static. I kind of remember them being static because I remember always being in the same group with the same kids. I didn't go to a very large school, and year after year kind of being with those same kids. I know that I was in the high group. I was a pretty advanced reader, and I do remember actually being jealous of the lower readers because they got to spend more time with the teacher, so they got pulled back more often, and they read more with the teacher while I was sitting at my desk doing a phonics workbook, which probably didn't make a lot of sense if I was a good reader. But anyway, I remember doing those closed connection cards. I don't know if any of you remember those, but I know I didn't like them. And so then kind of our purpose for this section is to think about what do you think the difference is between a program and an approach? So I'm not going to answer that right now, but I want you to have that question in your head as we continue this discussion. So we're going to talk about some programs and some approaches and think about what is the difference between those two. All right, so let's talk about first some methods of instruction. So before the 1960s, it was, all Basel's in terms of reading instructions. So I can say it was kind of Basel's or bust. There was the initial, and we're going to go over all of these later. So the initial teaching alphabet, which is also referred to as ITA, a program or an approach called Words and Color. I'll let you decide if they're programs or approaches. The Language Experience Approach, or LEA, which is one of the reasons that we're re-recording this is because it's actually seen a little bit of a resurgence, and we'll talk about that later. The Individualized Reading Approach, and today we would refer to what we have as kind of an eclectic, balanced approach. So that is supposed to be what all of the research-based programs tout, is this balanced approach, and they pull from many approaches of the past. And one of the things, another reason why I wanted to re-record this week is because I think one of the things that we've seen superficially in the past few years is this move back towards themes, but really not true thematic instruction or thematic units. But I think that we're going to actually see more movement back towards those. And so just a few years ago, when we would teach this class, thematic units as true thematic units were pretty much a thing of the past at that time, particularly in California, where all instruction was really in the classroom based on either the Houghton Mifflin or the open court reading. In many schools, there may have been schools that were taking a thematic approach, but it probably wasn't what they were referring to as their core reading program. But I think with the Common Core, that you're going to see the push towards that, because we need to, it seems to be the easiest way to include some of the project-based learning and to do some of the literacy across the curriculum areas, and to move towards inclusion of more expository text. So thematic units are what is going to get us there. So that's another reason why we needed to kind of change the screencast for this semester. So let's talk about published reading series. So there's the traditional Basel series, and if you remember at the beginning of the semester when we talked about the McGuffey readers, so the McGuffey readers are the first Basel, and they were leveled. They were leveled readers, and they had texts for each level. So part of the kind of in the Dick and Jane era, part of the issue or part of the problem with Basels as they started to evolve was that they were taking literature selections and they were actually changing the words within the text in order to level the text, so that you can run it through some kind of program. Well, you actually probably weren't running it through a program back in the Dick and Jane era, but you were applying a methodology to determine its level, based on kind of the complexity of the sentences and the actual words that they use. So they were taking literature selections and actually changing the text so that it would be accessible to students at particular levels. And so you're taking, rich literature selections and you're replacing the author's words. And so when you replace the author's words, a lot of people felt you were losing the true meaning and you weren't exposing kids to very authentic text, which I would tend to agree with. And so this is partially where true Basels got some of their bad rap from. And I didn't really myself understand that until I learned the history of reading instruction, because I, as a classroom teacher, only used Basels that actually weren't true Basels, but more like literature-based anthologies. And so they actually, had real pieces of literature, albeit excerpts, but they were, true to the author's intent and used the author's language. And so I didn't realize that they used to actually take them and kind of quote unquote dumb them down or make them more simple. So kind of a little backstory on where some people have negative feelings or negative attitudes toward Basels or towards true Basels. So some variations on traditional Basel series would be linguistic series, and so what they do is they kind of focus on one sound at a time. They are written to avoid irregularly spelled words. There's some elements of this in some programs like Open Court. They have sections like this, although not the entire series, but they do, and some of the lower levels try to control. They choose selections that control for the vocabulary, and you can do that because they're not necessarily choosing a lot of literature in the younger grades, so they can try to control the word choice and the language in there. There's intensive phonics series, and so those take a synthetic phonics approach. And if you remember, synthetic phonics would be practicing the sounds out of context, and so there are some programs that Basel series that work on that, and so those are sometimes the ones that schools choose or districts choose for intervention type programs. And then there's your literature based and language integrated series, so your anthologies. So this is kind of what we call a Basel now. This is what we use most commonly in the classroom, and so these have actually excerpts from the full text. So I know, like in third grade in Open Court, they have Charlotte's Web, and it's just a section of Charlotte's Web that makes sense and can kind of stand on its own. They do the same thing with Anne Frank. They do, they pick poems, or they pick speeches, or like Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, they turn into a story, but keeping with the original prose. So the it currently, or actually it's not currently, so I should have actually changed this slide, but for a long time, in California, your only choice was the Houghton Mifflin program or Open Court if you wanted to use state funds to buy them. And so we were one of the few states that had mandated reading curriculums. And so there were schools that could use other programs or were still doing literature circles. But those were likely schools that were already high performing. And so I know sometimes what I would do is when I would visit schools, I would see that Open Court and Houghton Mifflin had been purchased, but the actual anthologies were on the shelf, and what teachers were making use of was the leveled readers within them. So, if your students were already doing well, the teachers felt that they could get more authentic instruction by using if their districts had purchased the leveled reading series, which would usually be novels and shorter books around the topics that were in the theme of the anthology. So some of you who've used Open Court or Houghton Mifflin might say, really? People actually purchased those leveled readers? But they did. I actually worked in a school that had purchased them, but a lot of districts chose not to. They just purchased the anthology and then all the workbooks that went with it. So those are the two, but now we actually, there's a more flexible market for it, and I think that what was very sad is when when we recorded this screencast back in, like 2010 probably, there was a comment in this section saying, oh, and we're up for a new adoption cycle, but most districts don't have any money, so they haven't purchased them. Well, lo and behold, 3 years later, we are still in that same situation, although some of the bigger districts have purchased. I know LAUSD did a new purchase last year, 2 years ago. But many schools are still using either the Houghton Mifflin or the Open Court. But I think we're going to see a shift to more literature-based instruction as soon as the money starts coming in to implement Common Core. Right now, a lot of people are just making use of the literature that's within those, Houghton Mifflin or Open Court. And those, I keep referring to them, but those are the K-5 ones. A lot of districts had more flexibility in middle school to choose, and then in high school a lot of them are still using the core literature list from the state of suggestion of the books and the novels that you should use, but other schools in middle and high are using some Prentice Hall anthologies or other series, and the reason that they had more flexibility to choose those is because the money's coming to buy the reading series in the lower grades was coming out of the Reading First funding stream, and that was K3. So generally, you're not going to buy a program just for K3, you're going to buy it for K5, and so that's why they could have kind of more control over that than they had at the upper level. But I do anticipate that it will be a more flexible market as we move forward and we try to meet Common Core. So you talked in the chapter about some uses and misuses of Basel Reading Series, and those are total, using them as a total reading program. They address grouping, the directed teaching of skills, workbooks, and pacing charts. And so all of these can either be appropriate uses or misuses. So it's kind of a situation where the devil is in the details. Basel's shouldn't be a total reading program, and so actually if you look at anthologies like Open Court or Houghton Mifflin, they actually sell many other components, but what happens is they're expensive and districts choose not to buy them. So like they choose not to buy the leveled readers, and so really what's happening is just that anthology and the workbooks that come with it become the total reading program, and that's actually a misuse of Basel Reading Series. Having groupings that aren't flexible is also a misuse, and so that also refers to only teaching reading as a whole class. So either teaching reading as a whole class without any small group instruction, or just making those groups and never really changing them, or having it directed towards skills. That can be a example of a misuse. So that's not really how it should or is intended to be used. So I'm actually going to run out of time here, so I will pick up on the next screencast.